And one of the major objectives of the British in the 1760s was to impose more central control. Because the big problem for the British was, in some senses, they'd already lost America. Somewhere like New England, nearly all of the positions were elective, especially in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And so they were trying to do something that was retrospective, something they should have done a century earlier and that they'd allowed to escalate out of control. Now, I just want to give you a few examples of how they're doing very much the same thing and pursuing these new initiatives, not only in America, but elsewhere. And I'm going to give three examples: Ireland, India, and Canada. Ireland, in many ways, was much more subject to British control. In fact, Ireland was the great fear of most Americans of what America might become. There had been a declaratory act in Ireland, essentially giving Parliament absolute authority over Ireland, since 1720. And even earlier in Irish history, something called Poyning's Law in 1494, which essentially forced their Parliament to have any agenda item, first of all, authorized by the British Privy Council. So they could do nothing really without British oversight, something that American patriots were terrified might one day appear in America. In the late 1760s, the British started to tighten this control. They sent over a new governor called George Viscount Townsend. And if that name sounds familiar, it should, because this was the brother of Charles Townsend, who passed the notorious Townsend Acts, which included the tax on tea. And the older brother was made the Governor General of Ireland, and he became the first resident governor in Ireland. Rather like Virginia, the governors had not been resident. Now suddenly the governor was resident. So that didn't happen in Virginia until Lord Botetourt at the beginning of the 1770s. Not only did he become resident, but one of his main interests was enlarging the size of the British Army in Ireland. There were at any one time, since the late 17th century, 12,000 British troops in Ireland. They represented a third of the British Army. Throughout peacetime, Ireland had the biggest system of barracks anywhere in Europe. Dublin had the largest system, other than in Potsdam in Prussia. And the army was there essentially to maintain control. This was far more troops than had ever been sent across to America. And Townsend had orders from the British government to increase that number to 15,000, with 3,000 troops, all of them paid by the Irish Parliament, 3,000 additional troops who could be used by the British anywhere in the world, but all at the expense of Ireland. He eventually managed to get this passed through and to create a much more direct system of British government, doing away with the local Irish elite, who are known as the undertakers, who traditionally controlled measures in the Irish Parliament, and with much more direct authority from Britain using British patronage. In India, you have a different situation. India was run by a corporation. And I don't know why there's never been a more successful book on India, because it's a fascinating story. It was run by the East India Company, and this was the ultimate multinational. It not only was an international company, it had its own army and its own bureaucracy, and it ran a country. And this was a problem for Britain, because the East India Company was increasingly in debt. It increasingly was taking on more than it could really deal with. The size of the areas under its control got larger. The cost of defense, of having its own navy, were getting bigger. And yet, actually, it was more difficult for Britain to interfere in the East India Company than in America or Ireland, because it was a private company with a private charter. And many members of the company and stockholders were also members of Parliament. And the company divided down the lines of party politics. So it was a dangerous thing to try to control. Any kind of attempt by a government was accused by the opposition of attempting to grab the patronage of the company and using that to totally corrupt British politics, which was indeed a genuine danger. And yet in 1767, at the same time that Townsend was enlarging the army in Ireland, the government had a national inquiry, and it passed 3 bills to start to regulate the East India Company. 2 years later, in 1769, it successfully levied a tax on the company. It ordered that the company pay $400,000 a year for the next 5 years to Britain. It was successful in a way that it was never successful in America. But in 1772, there was an international credit crisis. Banks crashed. And this time, it was the opposition, not the government, led by another name that becomes famous in American history, General John Burgoyne, who insisted on an inquiry into the affairs of the East India Company. It resulted in essentially a show trial of a former Governor General, Lord Clive of India, who eventually committed suicide at the end of this process. And the following year, in order to try and offstay the opposition, in 1773, Lord North once again passed a series of laws that for the first time started to change the managing structure of the company and to intervene directly in the way that the company was run. Lucy Sutherland, who is the great historian of the East India Company, described it as an assault. And the final example I want to give is of Canada. In 1774, you have the Quebec Act, which actually, looking back, seems a very enlightened act, because it was going to give French Catholics freedom of religion in Quebec, and there were only 110 English-speaking people in this, or people who could have voted in Quebec, against 10,000 French subjects. So this seems very enlightened. They also allowed French law and a kind of French system of government. But of course, the French system of government was government without assemblies and government without representation. And in New England especially, this was interpreted as an attempt to create an absolutist French Catholic army with which to come down and crush the mainland colonists. And indeed, it certainly did strengthen Britain's hand. This was a form of much more direct government. The reason that these 3 examples are significant is that for a long time, and for much of the 20th century, the idea that the Patriots had real constitutional issues and that they had legitimate constitutional issues with Britain was often dismissed by professional historians, beginning first of all with the so-called imperial school, who were dominant in America from the 1930s and even earlier through the Second World War. The imperial school said these taxes were nothing. They're very small. The Tea Act, and Americans were paying about 1/50th of the tax of English people. This was really about people at home wanting to gain control. As one historian put it, it was the struggle for power at home, or people wanting to gain economic independence. The constitutional issues were not really that valid. And even the later school of historians, with Bernard Bailyn and known as the Republican school, who emphasized ideology, even they imply that the patriots were really reacting to conspiracy theories. And they were buying into conspiracy theories. But again, there's a sense that they didn't have genuine constitutional objections. And indeed, there's good reason why they might think like this. It's difficult to demonstrate that there was real tyranny in America in 1774. The British had really restrained from using their army. The worst example of military intervention was in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, in which, as you know, 5 people were killed. But what is remarkable about that massacre is those soldiers were then put on a civilian trial. 2 of them were branded and sent back to Britain. In fact, the officer and most of them were then discredited. So this is hardly an example. If we define tyranny as an absolute misuse of power, the disappearance of the rule of law, this would hardly be an example. And yet, by looking at what the British are doing elsewhere outside America, it's further proof that American complaints, constitutional complaints, were far from groundless. In fact, by looking at the context of the empire, one sees that the way that Britain was governing its empire was radically changing in the 1760s and 1770s. Parliament was making very new claims of its authority, which it had never made before. It had never taxed America before. And the reason that this was dangerous is that the boundaries had never been well defined. There was no written imperial constitution. It was unclear where British authority ended and where local autonomy began. And that was important because throughout the previous 100 years, each colony had started to create its own constitution, its own rights. Britain was, in fact, a federal empire and a federal system. The British argued you cannot divide power, but in reality, they'd been dividing power for 100 years, and that all changes in the 1760s. It was not a deliberate plan of tyranny, but what you could say is Americans were rebelling against a very real latent potential for tyranny. If they permitted taxes to be raised, that would have essentially enabled the British Parliament to totally bypass the system of representation.